I'm going to kick things off. It's 9 o'clock. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be here. I'm Jill Roshto, serving as Executive Director of LANO. Came on board right at the shelter at home time, so it's been an interesting summer and fall, but a really great and challenging one. Joined by Christian Beatty, our Associate Director. So grateful to Christian and all of her hard work in helping pull this off. I need to thank our sponsors, our presenting sponsors. This would not be possible without Blue Cross Blue Shield of Louisiana and Shell. And a special thanks to Shell. Their big generosity allowed us to really cover most of the expense of the conference, along with Blue Cross and our other sponsors, and make the registration only $25. Shell felt like it was really important in this challenging time when none of us have extra money in our budgets to make this affordable so that our nonprofits of the state can get this great information. And so we're really grateful to Shell and all of our great sponsors for helping us with today's event. Other sponsors include Hannes T. Bourgeois, Smoke Free Louisiana, Law Offices of Gray Sexton, and others. I've got a slide we'll be showing you with our sponsors, but we're very grateful to all of our sponsors for everything they've done to make this possible. At this time, I want to go on and kick off to our speaker. She has got a very involved bio. I'm going to try to hit the high points, but she is basically a rock star in her field, and we are very grateful to have her joining us from Memphis this morning. Vicki Floyd Clark has devoted the past 30 years of her life to building capacities in organizations, inspiring community and business leaders. She is a globally known speaker, facilitator, consultant, and trainer, extensive experience in nonprofit, government, and private sectors. She's got many specialty areas: board development, inclusion, diversity, leadership development, strategic planning. I mean, Vicki is your go-to. She can do it all. She speaks to thousands of community and business leaders, has made presentations in 49 of the 50 states and all over the world. She works with a variety of very well-known organizations and companies, including St. Jude's Children's Hospital, Dun & Bradstreet, Ronald McDonald House Charities, Junior Leagues International, and so many more. She's a senior governance consultant for BoardSource, and for 12 years, she was a vice president at the Points of Light Foundation in Washington, D.C. She's spoken at universities all over. We need to get you down here, LSU and Southern, and proudly serves as a member of the boards of the National Diaper Bank Network and Youth Volunteer Corps. She attended the University of Missouri and lives in Memphis, and we are so grateful to have her. Welcome, Vicki. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you condensed that. That bio gets longer and longer the older you are and the more jobs you've had. So I thank you for condensing that. And thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this conference. Really honored to be here, and can't imagine what you have all been through in the past few months, in addition to what all the rest of us have been through. So thank you all so much for everything that you are doing. So this morning, we're going to talk about boards and staff working together, and we're going to talk about moving to exceptional governance and the idea of facing the future and kind of not looking back. I think for the first 3 months during COVID, I heard people saying, I can't wait till we get back to normal. There is no back to normal. We have learned a lot. And just as Jill said, we've learned so much more about everything. And somebody said once, when you know better, you do better. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning when it comes to boards and to governance. So let's move on to the next slide. Let's keep moving. Anybody who's known me for 5 minutes knows that I like to have a good time. Of course, these would be none of your boards, where the motion has been made and seconded that we stick our heads in the sand, or perhaps it would help if we go over it one more time and everybody just faints out. But board effectiveness is definitely a challenge in nonprofits. And if we thought it was a challenge prior to COVID, and with you all of the storms and the economy and everything, it is even more critical at this point. So let's go on. This idea of thinking about the most complex pressing issues. I know that you think about your pressing issues as literacy and domestic violence and food insecurity and poverty and all of that. But governance and board development is a very pressing issue, because without an effective board that has good governance, structures, strategies, and processes, our nonprofits are not going to make it. In fact, what we've heard, I hope it is not true, that we will probably, the country will lose a third of the nonprofit organizations as a result of all that we've been dealing with, that there are a third of them that just are not going to make it, not because they weren't doing a good job, but because they were not well positioned and they did not have the capacity to keep going and to respond to the changes, and they weren't nimble enough. So let's keep going. So really think about your governance as an issue that is complex and that is pressing. I'm not going to read this. Everything has changed. And if it hadn't changed before 8 months ago, it definitely has changed now. And the idea, some of you know Pat Summitt, know who Pat Summitt was. Pat Summitt was the amazing women's basketball coach at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And one thing about Pat Summitt, I mean, she changed women's basketball. She probably changed women's sports, if you will, but that she talked about the willingness to experiment with change. You have to experiment with change. And I think for sometimes, if you look at your board and your governance structure, and it looks exactly like it looked 5 years ago, I mean, other than now we're all Zooming, but everything is pretty much the same, we're not experimenting. And it's okay to experiment with change. And she talks about that being the most essential ingredient to success at anything. And unfortunately, Pat Summitt died early onset dementia. But her willingness to experiment with things and to go into places that people had not gone in terms of what women's basketball and women's sports could be. So when you look at all of that, board members have changed. The way you deliver services have changed. Board meetings should have changed. We're going to talk about that. Fund development has changed. Everything has changed, or it should have changed. So this kind of could be a checklist for you. And Steve, it's Alaska. Steve wanted to know what's the one state that I haven't presented in, and it's Alaska. So the idea that exceptional boards make a difference, and it's all about the mission. Sometimes I think in nonprofit and as program people, and I've been you, I have worked in small nonprofits. I worked in a very small program in Houston when we moved to Houston, and then went to the volunteer center in Houston, and then worked a lot with the Texas governor's office on state volunteerism, and then worked at a national organization. So I'm not one of these people who has not been you. I'm not sitting back here saying, I read this, but I've been you. I remember the days when people like me, I was a volunteer coordinator. I didn't even know what the board did. I just knew that I had to wear pantyhose and not make popcorn. That was all they told me about the board. And because I didn't know what they did. And so the idea that staff and board didn't talk and all of that kind of madness that we all went through. And so the idea that it's about the mission of the organization. It is not about the programs. And we have to keep the board focused on the mission. And you notice I'm not talking about the mission statement. People ask me all the time, what should our mission statement look like? It look like it's used. There are people who write things like, your mission statement should fit on a t-shirt. Whose t-shirt? You can get a lot of words on my t-shirt. The idea is that the mission guides everything that you do, not the programs. And so the idea that the exceptional board makes a discernible difference in the journey of the organization. Let's move on. And many of you are familiar with Dr. Peter Drucker's work. And I was fortunate enough to be on his training team at the Drucker Foundation. And it totally changed my life. It changed my life personally, but it also changed my life professionally, because what he gave us was these 5 questions. And if every board would actually live by these 5 questions, we wouldn't have any problems. What is the mission? Where are we trying to go? Where are we trying to go? What's the journey that we're on? And then who is the customer? You say, we don't talk about customers. We talk about students. We talk about beneficiaries. Some of you talk about clients. We talk about, end users. Drucker uses the term as a universal term, as the primary customer is the person or the people or the entity whose life is most transformed. Because you're in the transformation business. You are not in the business of putting a Band-Aid on things. You're in the transformation business. That's what the nonprofit sector is all about. is transforming lives. So the primary customer is the person or the people or the entity whose lives are most transformed by the organization's mission. Everybody else, including the board, including your funders, including its partners, are supporting customers. You say, well, why is this important to the board? Because unless board members understand the reality of your primary customers and have a real relationship with your supporting customers, I'm not sure how they can govern. So everything comes back to, we're 1 and 2, the mission and the customers, and always providing value. What value does the board provide to your organization? There are old jokes that say something like, if all the board members went on a cruise, would anybody notice? Of course, now no one's going on cruises, but would anybody notice? And so the idea is, what's the value proposition? Because when we think of, you can actually think of the board also as a supporting customer. There's a kind of a schism and a symbiotic relationship that boards have with nonprofits, specifically with the executive director or the CEO, in that person guides them, but that person also reports to them. So the idea that the board has to bring value to the mission of the organization. And value is not merely money, but there has to be a value proposition in what the board provides. And then what are our results? I ask people a lot of times, let me see your board work plan. Many groups don't have a board work plan. They say, I can tell you when we meet. I can tell you what committees we have, but we don't actually have a board work plan. I also look at strategic plans, and I don't see anything in the strategic plan about the board, because a lot of our strategic plans, and I've done them too, were written to satisfy a funder. And if the funder didn't ask for it, we didn't put it in there. But the idea that you really need to have the board and the board's work in your strategic plan, and the board actually needs its own work plan. And the work plan is more than we meet on Wednesday. And that goes to what is the plan. So what we're going to talk today about is some ideas that you could incorporate. But these are magic questions. They're just magic. You can use them on a macro level about the whole organization, or you can use them on a micro level about the board. What is the board's relationship to the mission? How do they understand and respect our primary customers? And then how do they relate to all of our supporting customers? And then the board's value. So you could take this and just talk about board development and board relationships with this. So these are the magic questions. You could also use these magic questions to design agendas. So Dr. Drucker says plans are only good intentions unless they immediately degenerate into hard work. So let's talk about some hard work. This is not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth the trip. Let's move on. Everything the board does has to move the mission forward. So when somebody brings a great idea, many of you are going to go back from this conference, because you're going to get some great ideas, and say, I heard at this conference that these people were doing this, and why can't we do that? If it moves the mission forward of your organization, then fine, let's do it. But let's not just do it because they're doing it over here, or because we heard about it over here. So that becomes the North Star. And when people bring up suggestions, or should we stop doing some things? There are some things that we need to stop doing. And I think this is one thing that COVID has taught us, that some of the things that we were doing, we don't even know why we were doing them. We were doing them because it was Tuesday. Why are we doing this? Because it's Tuesday. Well, what's the reason for it? I don't know, because it's Tuesday. And so the idea that all board actions have to result in moving the mission forward and adding value to your partners and to whoever your customers are. Clearly defined outcomes. Everybody's talking about the same thing, same goals, and no hidden agendas. So let the mission drive everything that you do. When you're interviewing people, tell them about the mission of the organizations, not merely about the programs and how many board meetings they need to come to. It's a very different thing when you start letting the mission drive everything. It really opens everything up, and it gives you a lot more opportunities. Let's move on. We know one day can change everything. Prior to March 12th, I was traveling 300 days a year. I got stuck in Florida on March 12th. I finally made my way home the morning of March 13th, and I've been sitting here in headband and pajama pants ever since. So one day did change everything. And for you all, many days have changed everything with all that you have dealt with the storms and with COVID and with the economy. I'm an old oil and gas family. My ex-husband worked for Texaco and then for Shell. So I totally understand when I see that $1.99 or $1.89, on a sign of what gas costs. I know what that does to areas like yours. And then it says, in life change is inevitable, in business change is vital. You say, well, why should you put a business slide up there? Because you are in business. I'm not sure if most board members understand that being on a board and that the nonprofit is a business. It's a nonprofit business, but it is a business. And it has to be run like a business, and it has to have the strategies of a business. It doesn't lose its heart. But in terms of the governance and the way the organization is run, it is definitely a business. And we make business decisions that impact other people's lives. So let's keep going. This idea of being learners, I love. Jill is amazing. Jill and her team, Christian, they are amazing. They have rolled with it. You all are so fortunate in Louisiana to have LANO, but to have Jill and Christian, because they have rolled with it. They have just rolled with it, and they are learners. And it has been a pleasure to work with them. And Warren Bennett says, in times of drastic change, it's the learners who inherit the future. The learned find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. And I think a lot of us are finding ourselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. And we're having to relearn and revisit almost everything. Even things that were used to be so simple are now so complex. And it is frustrating. Trust me, it is extremely frustrating on a personal level as well as on a professional level. But the idea is that we show up in the world as learners. And I think it's important that board members understand that they are learners. I know there was a time when people were like, oh, if they're on the board, they know everything. We should talk to people and say, do you have board orientation? Oh, we can't have board orientation. We have nothing to teach the people from Texaco. We have nothing or the bank president. They won't come to board. They know how to be a bank president. They know how to run an oil company. I'm not sure what they know about a nonprofit. So the idea is that we want people who want to learn governance on our board. And I don't care if people have been on 30 other boards, your board is different. And so the idea is when we start to talking to people, are you a learner? Not what do you already, we want to know what they know, but are you willing to learn? Are you willing to adapt? These are all the things, because again, the old way was they knew everything, and nobody knows everything. We know what we know, but there are many things that we don't know. And in the past 10 years, governance, we know so much more about governance and board development. So we want board members to show up as learners. And at each board meeting or every board interaction, they need to have learned something about governance, about your issue, about your primary customers, about the organization. This idea of learning versus just doing is really, really important. And it will be the learners who inherit the future. Let's keep going. And this is one of my favorite quotes. So we need to forget who we are, who we think we are, so that we can really become what we are. Now, that can seem like it's messing with your head, but it's the idea of we need to forget kind of what we think our boards need to look like so that they can become what they need to look like in order to move our missions forward. Otherwise, we won't survive. And nobody wants to just thrive. And right now, a lot of us are in thrive mode, again, personally and professionally and organizationally, but we want to move to survive. I mean, we're in survive mode and we want to move to thrive mode. Let's keep going. This idea of looking at this time, these are tough times, and you all have had it tougher than a lot of folks, but we got to look at this as an opportunity. It's kind of, what Pat Summitt was saying. Look at create an environment on the board that embraces change, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And I wouldn't have wished 2020 on anybody, but I think we're all learning something from 2020. If we would just take a minute to say, what are we learning? And it says, you never know what results come of your actions. But if you do nothing, there will be no results. So if after all this is over, or if we just keep operating the way we've always been operated, we really won't have any results, because there is no going back. So we look at this and say, what's the opportunity in this? What is it that we can learn? And then we'll talk about it later. What are some things we need to unlearn? There are a lot of things that we need to unlearn in nonprofits. So yes, this is a threatening time. No, I'm not Pollyanna. I know this is a threatening time, but we also have to look for the opportunities in this time. When I talk about leaders, I'm not just talking about formal leaders. My definition of leaders is people, anybody who can touch anybody's life in a positive way. And you all are the ones who are creating this environment that embraces change, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And you all are the ones who've been keeping your board members, and some of your board members have been keeping everybody else from running around with their hair on fire. I'm on 2 boards. And when I'm on those boards, I'm a board member. I'm not this person. I'm a board member just like everybody else. And so the idea of being concerned about the organization and how will we do this and how will we do that, and we're having to have virtual conferences and the same type of things and issues with funding. But then there are some opportunities that we are seeing during these challenging times. Let's keep going. We have to change the way we look at boards. Many of you use a grid. We need this person. We need a CPA. We need a lawyer. We need a person with a Hispanic surname. We need this. It's time to let go of those grids. And we're going to talk a little bit about diversity, but it's not about tokenism, and it's not about what job. That no one is representing their company on a board anymore. That 990 has my name on it. That 990 has everybody's personal name on it. It does not say Shell Oil Company. It does not say, American Airlines. This is a personal responsibility. So we have to change the way we look at boards. I know in the jobs that I had in Houston, we went around trying to get somebody from every company. That was before everything changed with the 990s. And so we've got to change the way we look at boards. And if we change the way we look at things, the things we look at will change. And so I think it's really important that people understand that this is a personal responsibility that they have, and that we are not looking for people because of their job. Yes, we need certain skill sets, but that can't be the only vetting process that we put someone through in terms of who's going to be on the board because they are a lawyer, or because they're a CPA, or because they're part of the community foundation or something like that. So we're going to change the way we look at boards. Let's keep going. This idea that we want exceptional boards and who are energized to plan turnover, thoughtful recruitment, and inclusiveness. And they understand mission, strategy, board composition, fresh perspectives, and they understand the risk of closed groups. And this idea of revitalizing themselves through diversity of experience and through continuous recruitment. Now you're saying, what do you mean by continuous recruitment? And we will get to that. But the idea that how does a book plan turnover? I hope you're using your term limits. I really do. And I hope you see the correlation of mission and strategy and understand the importance of fresh perspective. Boards can get very cliquish. And at worst, boards can become a gang. Of course, none of your boards are like that, but they can. Let's keep going. This idea of governance, it's group action. And it's not only doing things right, but it's doing the right things at the right time for this organization. So when somebody comes and says, yes, I was on this other board and we did this, and I think you should do this. Well, we got to figure out how this works with our mission. And the board is acting as agents for the agency's constituents. And it's idea of making sure, and when I talk about power, I'm not talking about just ruthless power, but authority over an organization on behalf of the community that the organization serves. That's a very interesting way of thinking about governance, because it will change what your board looks like. And the idea of doing the right things at the right time for the right reason for this organization. And you notice we're talking about effectiveness, we're not talking about efficiencies. Let's keep going. this idea of what's the culture of your board. If we were going to do this for a half day and we were all in person, and that would be so great because I love coming to Louisiana. And the idea of boards are made up of people and they're volunteers. And it's always been interesting to me how in nonprofits we have this line between folks that we call volunteers and people that we call board members. But what's the culture of the board? And that would be an interesting exercise for you to say, what is the culture of the board? What are the shared beliefs? How do we get the work done on a day-to-day basis? How does this group operate? And then what are the board's practices? What are the board's practices and strategies that are helping to move us forward? And what are some of the ones that we need to release? And then what are the behaviors of the leaders? Because it really comes down to people and it comes down to culture. And every group has its own culture. And we have to keep working on our culture to make sure that our culture is more inclusive, that our culture is more open, that our culture is transparent, and just making sure that the culture is a generative culture where everybody participates in a way. And so it'll be interesting to kind of do a SWOT analysis of your board culture. What are the strengths of the board? What are the weaknesses? What are the threats? And what are the opportunities of the board? That would be great, something to do at the board, at your board retreat. The interesting thing would be to have the board do it and then also to have staff do it and take a look at how those two mesh up. But it's like, what's the culture of the board? If I join your board, am I welcomed? Or is it so cliquish and that people, they're nice to me? Because I mean, we're all Southerners and we're nice to each other. But the idea of, do I really become part of the group? Or do I have to turn into something else? Do I have to totally assimilate to become part of the group and all of that? So what is the culture of the board? Let's keep going. This idea of the relationships with the board and the staff, there are boards and staff that have a very dysfunctional relationship. It's dramatic, it's disengagement, there's conflict, negative conflict, because all conflict is not bad. And that's when a board is like a game. And then functional it's of no real consequence. They meet, they eat, they sign some papers, Then we move to responsible, they're compliant, they do everything that state of Louisiana and the federal government says. What we want to do is move toward exceptional, to where they anticipate, and for those of you who are board members, you plan and you see opportunities for the future. Now, this is not whole cloth. There may be on the board pieces of the board that are very dysfunctional. Maybe the committees don't meet. I don't know. So you don't have to look at this as a whole cloth. You can say, or maybe the meetings are dysfunctional. I don't know. But just taking a look at all pieces, and I'm going to show you a board development cycle that you can actually look at and say, maybe our recruiting is dysfunctional, or maybe our recruiting is just functional. And we can look at all of the boards, the things that the board does. But this is kind of a way of looking at it. And this is not being critical. We just need to be honest about where we are and then move forward. And we do not need to play the blame game. When Vicki was the president, we lost all that time and she wanted to do everything her way. We don't need to do that. We need to just try to move forward. Let's keep going. This is another way of looking at it, is looking at your board engagement. Is it governance as attendance? We come again. Then we have governance as micromanagement, which is where a lot of boards were in its early years. Boards were micromanaging because they were heavily involved in the day-to-day operation. Then it was governance as observation, where the board just kind of sits and watches. I worked for an organization that will not be named, where the board chair would slide in 15 minutes before it was time for the board meeting. And it was like a puppet show, because our ED, it was like she had her hand up the back of his shirt and he was saying whatever, was there. And it was like, okay, why are we here? Or governance as leadership, where the ED or the CEO and the staff is in constructive partnership with the board, and together they are leading. So this is just another way of looking at this. Let's keep going. This idea is it has to be a constructive partnership, trust, adaptability, and balance. And I think one thing that COVID, the storms, the economy has given us is if there were ever a time that you wanted to try to change something, or you wanted to experiment with something, or you wanted to revisit something, it's now. This is now. It is now. You want to rip the Band-Aid off, rip the Band-Aid off right now and try something, because that's one of the opportunities that we have now, is to try some new things. And so this idea of balance, trust, and adaptability and a partnership. Let's keep going. This idea of the board knows what's the board supposed to do. Assure adequate organizational capacity. And that does not just mean money, that means staff also. It has been fascinating to me how lean nonprofits run from a staff standpoint. We know that the greatest asset in an organization, a nonprofit, is its staff. And the idea that so many of you are doing so much with so few staff. The idea that the board establishes direction, mission, vision, and it's which way are we going? And then maintaining governance structures and processes. First of all, they keep you legal, keep you in business, but also learning more about governance, and then monitoring and strengthening organizational performance, but also the board's performance. I don't know how many of you actually do board evaluations, but this is like the core way the board should be operating. So let's keep going. And then these are all these challenges. There's a lot of nonprofits, and this was before COVID. The whole technology, which we've gotten better with, the different regulations, the way the 990s have come down, the way what's changing with being able to deduct funds. But your customers are changing. Your supporting customers are changing. Social trends are changing. All of these things are challenges. And it would be interesting to see at a board meeting, do we discuss this? We could take one of these per meeting for 10, 15 minutes. I'm a pragmatist. Because some of you are sitting here saying, lady, we don't have time to do all this. I'm saying that you could take one of these changes or these challenges or one of the changes on the other and have a 15-minute discussion about it. And then public perceptions. There's very little trust. In fact, the nonprofit sector is still the most trusted sector, but we're still running into issues where people don't trust, because in certain communities, we always have some malfeasance. We always have some malfeasance. Again, this is a business like any other business. So the idea of having the board to actually discuss some of these challenges, one at each meeting for about 10 to 15 minutes, somebody do a briefing and then say, okay, where are we on this? And what should we be doing? Not what should staff be doing? What should we be doing as a board? What should we? Do we really understand who our primary customers are? Do we really understand the youth? Do we really understand the parents? Do we really understand the ill? Maybe we don't. Maybe we need a briefing about the issues surrounding them. And then the idea of advocacy. It is so important. And so many boards are afraid of advocacy because they don't understand it. They think it's political, versus we need to make sure that my city council member, my county commissioners, in your case, your parish folks, and your state legislators, as well as your US legislators, all the way up, know that I'm on your board and what this board does. That is one thing that the board can do. Oh my gosh, every board member can just follow their own train and just let everybody know. You say, well, what good is that? Think about it. It's critical. And that in itself is advocacy, and constantly making sure that people who are on their line understand what your organization does from them, not from a staff person. These are things that the board can do. So let's keep going. We've talked about this idea of challenge. How do we overcome them? Some of them we have to accept. And what's our motivation for doing this? And what kind of support do we need? That's an important piece, is what kind of support do we need? And it's not who do we know. Let's just say what you all are very fortunate to have a statewide nonprofit organization, and that can help you with so many things. So please don't just look inside, look big to look. But what are the key challenges? And they may be changing every month for you, but that's okay. We just have to keep recalibrating them and prioritizing them and then working on them. And the board has to be a part of this. Let's keep going. this idea of being resilient, and obviously you're very resilient. I mean, with everything that you all are dealing with, it's unbelievable. I can't imagine what it's like with the storms and many of you being displaced. I have friends who live in Lake Charles and they're still in Houston. I'm not sure if they're ever coming back to Lake Charles. And she's been in the nonprofit world forever. And, she's getting close to retirement. I don't know if they're going to, return to Lake Charles. You all are dealing with all of that, and we have to acknowledge the current reality. And that just means own it with no blame, and then reconnect back up to the mission and the values, communicate the touch points. And that just means if we don't know, we just say we don't know. Here's what we're thinking about. Here's what we're working on, and then focus on the future. And I think it's really important that the board be involved in this, and that people hear from the board chair, and that your partners, your funders, your sponsors hear from board members. And then what would success look like today? And it may just be we're going to make it through the day. But what does it look like today? And then adjust in the future, and then just swim with the current. But the board has to be a really big part of this, and being connecting with sponsors and funders and and donors and other nonprofits, and then reconnecting with who we really are, because sometimes we went so far down the program path, or down the we're going to apply for this funds, or we're going to apply for that funds, or we're going to get this person on the board because they can bring a lot of money with them. Somehow we have mixed donors with governors. All donors don't make good governors. Just because I can give you a lot of money doesn't necessarily mean that I would be really great on your board. I might just be a great donor, and there's nothing wrong with being a great donor, but all donors don't have to be on your board, and probably should not be. And then the idea that the role of board members as donors, the idea that I could be a great board member, and I may be a fairly small donor. I mean, I want to give something, but I may be a very small donor. But man, I may be really good with governance. Or I may be really good with forward thinking. And so the idea of all major donors have to be on the board and all of that, we need to that's another thing that we need to do, is sing the Frozen song and let that go, because donors and governors, those are two different jobs. And obviously you all don't break. You just bend and then you stand back up. So let's keep going. This idea of these challenges, avoid the tactics trap. Sometimes right now, and yes, all of us are doing things as board members that we hadn't thought about doing. Again, I'm on 2 national boards, but we have to be careful to stay out of the minutia. If staff ask us, then we respond. Like when many organizations were putting out their statement after Mr. George Floyd was killed, board member, we were asked to review it and those types of things. We do what we're asked to do in that, but we don't get so deep into the minutia, because we have to stay in this big picture, because if we don't, we'll lose it. Staff can take care of the management. And so this big picture advisor, and we don't want to dampen staff initiative and let and staff just take over. We don't want to do that. Staff needs to do what they do, but the board has to stay focused on the big picture. And it's hard to stay focused on the big picture when everything is going crazy. No, we're doing some things, I think, as board members that we didn't think we would do, but that's not really our role. And so we have to continue to stay focused on this big picture. So we need to be careful about that. And most people on boards like to fix things. That's why one of the questions should be, are you okay with ambiguity? How are you with big picture thinking? Versus, I love literacy and I want every child to have a book. That's fine. That's not the role of the board. We got a great program. You'd be a great program volunteer, but that's not the role of the board. And so it's okay to teach people, how are you? Can you be a big picture thinker? Do you mind working with things that may not come to fruition for 2 years or 3 years? That's that ambiguity piece, versus people who say, I love this issue and I want to help the women. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we want people who are big picture thinkers. Let's go to the next challenge. The sacred cows. COVID has killed more sacred cows than anything. And I'm not talking about people, killed a lot of fundraisers that needed to go, that so needed to go, and that people were afraid to let them go, killed a lot of these practices and all of these things of meeting every month if you don't have to. You know, the boards are the keepers of the mission. And so the idea is, what is best? And what is it that we need to stop doing? What is it that we need to stop doing that no longer work and do not serve our mission? And we need to honor them. Don't get me wrong. We need to honor them. We need to honor the people who worked on them, whatever it is. It could be an event, it could be a practice, it could be a policy. Some of this stuff has needed to go. And you know that as board members and staff members, you know that. But people were like, well, not on my watch, and everybody will get upset. And you know, my mama helped get that started, and all the things that we hear and that we say. But it is really time to say what really is serving the organization best. So this is one of the things that we have an opportunity to do, but we do it with honor. We honor it, we honor the people, we lift it up, and we release it, and we sunset it. And so, you know, that's the way we do it. We don't just go, oh, I'm glad we're not doing that anymore, because that's disrespectful to people who have worked on it. Same thing with staff. There are things that staff realize that they don't need to do anymore, but that's for staff to decide. That is not for the board to decide. Let's go to the next one. This idea of a scarcity mentality. This is scary times. This is scary times. And people are hunkering down around, you know, and it's interesting to look at reserves. I don't know how many of you have reserves. I don't know how many of you have dipped into your reserves. That's what reserves are for. You know, this idea of a bunker mentality doesn't serve us well. This idea of balancing a scarcity mentality with what could we make out of this? And then looking at innovation and how do we do this in different ways, but not too tight. I know there are some boards, there's no more training, there's no more of this. It's like, wait a minute. We can't stop all of that. We need all of it for program money. Hold on. You got to take care of your staff. Staff continues to need to be trained. We still need board orientation. We still need board training. We still need all those things, everything. You cannot run an organization totally on running a program or programs. And so the idea of this scarcity mentality, which can be very frightening as a board member of 2 national boards, I know, but the idea of we have to kind of balance it. And yes, many of us are going to go into reserves. And so there are going to be a lot of budgets that we're not going to make budget this year. We're going to have some deficit budgets. But as long as the board has a deficit reduction plan, then, you know, that's not a problem. But we don't stop, we don't pull things out just because we have a scarcity or a poverty mentality, if you will. And so let's not, and again, I think staff is going to be important for you and board leaders to help board members to not be scared, to be cautious, but not to be so scared that you start taking away things that are really vital to the organization. And it's a balance to the organization continuing. And the good news is most of the conferences are much cheaper now. People can do online training, those types of things. There's all board retreats are being held online. There are a lot of things. We don't have to just zip everything out. And then the idea of taking care of staff. Some nonprofits are giving staff election day off. That's been a big push here in Tennessee. Our nonprofit resource center Momentum has been behind that. They've been behind that. They've been saying, if we can't give staff off one day to vote, then, what are we doing? Also, what they have decided to do is, and we'll talk about this scarcity mentality, they are not going to promote any jobs that pay less than $15 an hour in nonprofits. Now, that doesn't mean the nonprofits aren't going to have jobs that pay less than $15 an hour, unfortunately. But our nonprofit resource center says they're not going to post any of those. This idea is people need to make a living, and it is incumbent upon board members to understand that this is a profession. Nonprofit management is a profession. And people need to make a decent living, and people need to have insurance, and people need to have everything else that board members have in their lives and their jobs. And that's a really, that's a very different way of looking at things. And I think it's important for board leaders, those of you who are board leaders, to advocate for staff, and staff leaders to advocate, CEOs and executive directors to advocate for staff, and to keep pushing for what you need, and helping board members to understand people are not doing this to go to heaven. You wouldn't be in nonprofits if you didn't believe in creating a just and caring world. But this is a profession, just like any other profession. And it is a mighty profession. The nonprofit sector employs so many people in this country. We are a real force. That's why it was so important that for the first time we were included, the nonprofit sector was included in the stimulus. So it's like, okay, we have finally arrived. Unfortunately, many nonprofits did not have the capacity to apply for the funding, for the so that you could replace salary money. They did not have relationships with the bank. They weren't able to be nimble enough. And I'm not going to say that's on staff. I think that's on board, that the board has to make sure, what's your treasurer doing? Your treasurer needs to make sure that you got a relationship with the bank, so that when something like this comes up, you all know who to call. And then how can you respond quickly when opportunities like this come up? Because they're going to come back. Once you're in, you're in. They really don't kick you out. And so this idea of thinking, okay, maybe we weren't able to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program now, but what is it that we need to do? This is when you go and talk to your legislators. Because they don't know who you are. You're not in it. So the idea of building on this. And so that's what a lot of this is about now. Let's go to the next one. This idea of refueling, this idea of constantly talking about its success, the staff, the energy that we need, and everybody, board members are human beings. And we've been stuck in our houses too, and we don't know what's going to happen with some of our jobs and all of that. So it's important for the board to take care of the board. You say, well, wait a minute, I thought that was the executive director's job. No, you're going to get some materials about a governance committee. The governance committee is the nominating committee on steroids, meaning that it is the board members who take care of the board members, who call other board members, who say, how are you doing? Can we do anything for you? How's it going with you? What do you think you can do this year? Or what do you think you can't do this year? This idea of constantly making sure that we celebrate, and we're not celebrating in person, but we can write each other notes. We're going back to a lot of stuff. We're going back to writing handwritten notes, board members thanking staff for what they are doing, because staff is unbelievable. These are all the type of things that board members can actually do. And then to make sure that board members are okay. And if they're not, what can we do to help them? And this is board to board. The governance committee takes care of the board, and they are board members. And I will tell you a story. A governance committee member of a board I was on talked me off a ledge because I had a job that I could not do on the board. They had me as a committee chair, and that's when I was traveling. There's no way. And I said, I can't be a committee chair. I'm not going to be an effective committee chair. And you know what they did? They patted me on the shoulder and said, oh, yes, you can. You can do it. You can do it. And I went, okay. I will go down in history as being the worst committee chair. Somewhere there will be a plaque with my picture on it with a big X across my face saying she was the worst committee chair we ever had. So I was going to resign from the board because I felt guilty. And my governance representative, so what the governance committee does is divide the board up, and so everybody has about 4 or 5 people that they stay in touch with. And my governance representative called me, and I started crying. And I said, I'm ready to resign. I have totally let everybody down. I love this organization. I love this issue, but I have not done well. And she said, hold it. First of all, stop crying. And I said, I can't do this because I teach this and I'm just messing up. And I know she stopped crying. And she said, you were in the wrong place. You told us you couldn't do this. And we would not respect your no. We have to learn to respect the no of board members. And she said, we have to find the right place for you. And I said, I'm fully ready to resign. She said, we don't want you to resign. We have to find the right place for you. So don't forget, board members are volunteers. Nobody wants to fail. Nobody wants to be missing in action. And so they found the right place for me. And now I feel like I'm a participating member of that board. But it was board to board. And so you're going to get information about having a governance committee. And the governance committee is always looking for people and recruiting people and going out talking to groups, not necessarily putting people on the board, but talking to people and making sure they're board members. It is the governance committee who gets in touch with each one of us about our gift every year. Will you be able to make a gift? Thank you for your gift from last year. It is not the executive director. It is governance to governance. So this idea of refueling the board, the energy and staff, and that's even more important now. Let's go to the next one. This idea of succession planning. Don't panic, executive directors. I'm not trying to replace all of you. And don't panic, board members. That's not the idea. We have to have succession plans. And a succession plan doesn't say, hey, when Vicki goes away, you get the job. It's what is our process? I can't tell you how many boards don't know what to do. We need an emergency succession plan, and we need a plan for succession plan for board leadership as well as for staff leadership. And this is really, really important. And there's information about succession planning that I can get to LANO, but it's really important. And it's not about, again, anointing and appointing the next person. It's what is the process? And is the job description up to date? And helping everybody understand that we're not trying to replace anybody. When somebody leaves, oh, we're going to replace Jane. You don't replace human beings. We get the next executive director for the future. We don't try to replace anybody. Same thing with the board chair. And if a board chair, has to drop out for whatever reason, who's on deck? Do we have a vice chair? Do we have a chair elect? I don't know. But what we need, 4 plans, 2 for staff leadership and 2 for board leadership, planned and emergency succession plan. And I will caution board members against making someone staff member the acting executive director when you have no inclination that person is going to get the job. Because that person is the acting executive director for 6 months, 8 months, then go out and hire somebody, bring them in. You tell that person, oh, you need to train him or her. Now you got a staff problem. So the idea of interim executive directors, many people are hiring interim executive directors. There's lots of things that are going on in this succession planning area, but be very careful about how you manage staff in these situations, specifically if it's an emergency situation with an executive director or a CEO. Let's keep going. Oh, and that's even if you just hired somebody. This is not just if you have a 20-year or 30-year or you got to have it for everybody. We don't know what's going to happen to anybody, and we never did. This idea of big picture, innovative ideas, things we've never tried before, being okay with the complexity. Things are not as simple as reports make them sound. And then something called appreciative inquiry. Everybody ought to have a question to ask at every board meeting. You say, we don't have time for all that. They can submit their questions prior to, because we don't know. So the idea of what questions do you have? And maybe you can say, so what questions do you have about finance? Or what questions do you have about program? Or what questions do you have about risk management? Do you know up until COVID, many boards had never had a conversation about risk management? They had never talked about their officers and directors insurance. They had never had a conversation about risk management when it is the board members who are responsible for the organization. So this idea of everybody having a question at every meeting and then thinking horizontally and simultaneously. What we do in most organizations, we think like this. We think vertically. This program, this program, this program, versus the board should be thinking like this all across the organization. That's why we say we got to get out of the program mentality and get into the mission mentality. Let's go to the next one. This is just talking about unlearning. This would be an interesting 5-minute exercise to say, what is it that we need to unlearn? And unlearning is okay. You're doing both of these things at once. You're trying to change things and do differently, but you're also trying to be a new way of being, because we know because we know that we got to be a new way. So we're flying the airplane and we're building it at the same time. And that is very difficult. And then we're learning new things and we're unlearning some things. And I'm not saying this is easy. These are very complex ways, especially when we've done things the same way for so long that we've gotten into a routine, if you will. And so the idea is we break the routine. So what is it that I wish we were doing this a half day in person? I would ask you is what is it that you need to unlearn? And then what is the new way of being? Let's keep going. It's not to change or do you in, it's transition. Transition is what's here in the heart. You know, I told you I was at the worst program. I was the worst chair of that committee. I kind of said, well, I'm not going to be a committee chair anymore. I mean, I had to get over it because I was doing a bad job, but that was that transition thing that said it. Change is situational. Transition is what people go through. Like when you get ready to sunset something, say a fundraiser that wasn't doing well or a policy that really wasn't certain, people go, but you know, it really was great back in the day. And people are like, it was? That's just internal. And William Bridges writes a lot about managing transitions personally and in organizations. So if you know, it'd be a great thing is to look at some of Bridges' work. We're going to look at a little bit of it now. Keep going. Next slide. This is not board 101 because you don't need board 101. You can look up the basic board responsibilities. This is the next level. This is the next level of exceptional board, the constructive partnership with staff, mission-driven, strategic thinking. You notice it doesn't say strategic planning. You got to have that, but you got to think strategically before you can plan. The culture of inquiry where we all ask questions, independent mindedness, not individuals, but meaning we do what we need to do for this organization, and more and more and more transparency. Constantly letting people know what we're doing, sending information to our donors. You say they don't read it. You don't care whether or not they read it. Your job is to get it out there. And then this idea of compliance with integrity. The laws are changing every day. Every day, the laws are changing. The responsibilities are changing. We got to have somebody on the board who is staying on top of this. Sustaining resources. And what's the best resource? Staff. And being results oriented rather than process oriented. And then intentional practices. And we'll get to some of those intentional practices. Continuous learning and revitalization in that we use our term limits. You know, and this whole thing of, I don't know what we'll do if we lose X on the board. Just because I'm not a governor of your organization doesn't mean that I cannot and should not support your organization. In fact, if I've been on your board and I roll off term limits and you never see me again, I was probably the wrong board member. And just because I'm not on your board doesn't mean that I can't support your organization, promote your organization, advocate for your organization, be on a committee. That's the other thing. Board committees can actually have people who are not on the board. The board committees must be chaired probably by a board member, but let's have some other people on the committees. And so these are these exceptional principles. This is not board 101. This is the next level that power exceptional boards. Let's keep going. We just talked about this, the trustworthiness, that we do have some efficiencies, money, time, and energy. That's why we can't work staff to death. And executive directors, you know, you need to be able to say, you know, we're giving people this day off, or we're going to do this. And again, the only person that works for the board is the executive director or the CEO. That is the person who manages the rest of the staff. And as board members, we need to stay out of the rest of it. And then the idea we've talked about is outcomes and results, not only for the organization, but for the board. So let's keep going. These trends in board development, boards are smaller, fewer board meetings. Why do we meet every month? I don't know. Maybe we need to unlearn that. Why don't we meet once this month and then the committees meet 1 month? I don't know. You know, we know that there is an increased reliance on technology, but we have to be careful and try to keep it human if we can. Board members are learning the difference between governance and support and donors, focusing on impact and results. It is harder to get people on boards because people are getting smarter. You know, I've gone to board development I've done board development sessions, specifically in Florida, for people who want to be on boards, and they're asking questions. How much should the directors and officers insurance be? And what is my responsibility? I'm like, this is so cool. They're going to be great board members. But when they go to many of the nonprofits, what? Huh? Oh, let me look that up. Let me think about that. And so the idea is that board members are getting more savvy, and we're glad for that. And recruitment is getting harder because people are really understanding that this is real. This is not just showing up on Wednesday and have a sandwich, approving the minutes and nodding and listening to a report. They really are understanding what this is all about. And that's the good thing. The whole pressure for boards to, and I'm not going to call it fundraising anymore. We're talking about fund development, is growing. Many boards, when you got an executive director, everybody went like, phew, or you got a development person, phew, okay, they'll raise the money. The board still has a lot of fund development responsibility. And there has to be a strategy for the board to raise funds or to help to develop the funds in the organization. And number 8 is really important. Moving from this, who do you know? I remember years ago in Houston when somebody was going to move and somebody said, well, okay, you need to replace yourself. I didn't know it was a bad thing. Somebody said, well, I can get my cousin. Why? There was no process. She can get her cousin. This idea of personal connections to strategic diversity, inclusion. And inclusion and diversity are critical. This idea of, do you take applications on board members? Do you do background checks? You do background checks on frontline volunteers. Many boards do not do background checks. It's fascinating to me that boards, I can go on a board, not the two I'm on, but most boards you can go on and they will not do a background check. There is no application process. Why are we not using the internet to recruit? Somebody says, well, then we'll get somebody that we don't know. Wouldn't that be great to get somebody that we don't know? Somebody who's coming with new ideas. Why do we have to know everybody? This is not a club. It is a governance team. And so the idea of moving from personal connections to strategic diversity with people from different parts of the city and people who, people who do all different kinds of things, and even having former beneficiaries on the board. This is the way we need to go. And this idea of personal connections and who do you know? That's why the governance committee should always be out there, always be looking for people and keeping people, informed. Let's invite people to come to our board members meetings. People sample now. Nobody joins in the blind anymore. And your board meetings are all open. You know that by the Open Meetings Act. Let's have people come. And then let's have somebody from the board meet with folks and see, are they ready? And are we ready for them? So we're moving from this who do you know to strategic recruitment and identification of potential board members. Let's keep going. I got way too much stuff for y'all. We talked about this. Can we stop reading reports at board meetings? Can we really stop reading reports at board meetings? Executive directors, you don't need to read your reports. Nobody needs to read their report. You might have a finance report or something like that. People can read. And if we had done Board 101, the most important thing is that I'm prepared. And so I get my stuff a week ahead or 2 weeks ahead. I read it. And then if I have questions about it, but sitting around doing reports is such a waste of time. Somebody says, well, they won't read it. If you stop doing the reports, they'll eventually read. So this idea of having conversations, doing SWOT analysis, talking about some of these challenges, looking at succession planning, all these types of things, making a board work plan, breaking up into little groups and doing some work, rather than sitting there listening to some reports about something that has already happened versus I would like to put a generative question to the group. What could we do about X, Y, and Z? And then you give us, you say, well, everybody doesn't speak up. Let's start having people write on stickies. Well, we're on Zoom now, but let's have everybody put an idea in the chat. So it's more retreat-like than we just sit and nod and go, The risk management is huge. Again, if you didn't know it before 8 months ago, you know it now. With all of that, many of you are having to do to go back to in-person service, as well as for your staff. How are you protecting staff? How are you protecting beneficiaries? What's going on? People are now having to pay to have things sanitized and what is your risk, what is your insurance liability, all of those types of things. It is so important for the board to really take the lead on that. And orientation and training for the board is from informal to formal. It's real. Now, you don't get notebooks anymore. Some people still like notebooks. I like notebooks, but I'm kind of old. But the idea is you do online, people can make videos. I get my report. We get our reports on one board that I'm on. Each of the staff members makes a video. And so we have to listen to those videos before, we should listen to those videos before the board meeting. They do their report on they make a video. And so that saves so much time. It's really great, but the orientation, if it cannot be done in person, it still has to have a formal, here are the things that we cover. And it's not a one-shot thing. It can go over 2 or 3 months. I can still be on the board, but I'm still in the process of orientation. Also having board mentors, somebody who helps walk me through and helps me to understand what's going on. And that's a good thing. And select your board mentors very carefully. Everybody can't be a board mentor. You have to like people, and you have to want to be in touch with people and help to bring them along. So again, you notice the board is taking care more of itself than having the executive directors or the CEOs do a lot of this work. And then again, mission-related knowledge about the issue and understanding the organization's customers. And if I don't respect your customers, then I don't need to be on your board. If I want to fix them, if I think they had a bad life because they messed up their lives, I don't need to be on your board because I don't respect your customers. I also don't need to feel sorry for them. I need to have empathy for them. And I need to try to understand what the issue is. So these are really important things to talk to people about. And then individual evaluations for board members. And it doesn't have to be hard. Everything going well for you? What is it that you would like to learn more about? What was your best experience? And those types of things. And again, this is what the governance committee does. And then an overall board evaluation. And definitely the board evaluates the executive director or the CEO once a year, even if that person is not going to get a monetary raise. And there are many formats out there. And that is an important piece. Everybody likes to know how they're doing, setting goals at the beginning of the year or whenever you can. And it happens at a certain time. And so we got individual board evaluations, the total board evaluation, and then the assessment of the executive director. And then the executive director evaluates other staff members. Let's keep going. This is a lot. This idea of moving from what's wrong to what's the problem to how do we fix it. You notice you move from the fiduciary to, what's the question, rather than what's wrong. A lot of it is what's wrong. No, now what's wrong? What's the plan? And then the big thing is what's the question? And in that fiduciary mode or that gotcha mode, we define the problems. Second, strategic, we solve the problems and shape a strategy. Then we frame the problems. And then we try to make sense out of it. Where did it come from and how can we avoid it? So these are just different modes that boards can be in. And there's nothing wrong with the fiduciary mode. We just need to move more to the right, where we actually are learning and we're actually framing questions and we're getting a fresh perspective. Okay, we'll get to the question, Barbara. Thank you. Keep going. You just change the way you live. We've all changed the way we live. When you change your thoughts and perceptions, you change the way you live. And that's when the board has to change the way it lives. I want to get to the board development cycle, which is coming up. Let's go to the next one. You're going to get this document, the 3 stages in a nonprofit board's life cycle, and it talks about the organizing and the founding board, transitioning to a governing board, and then the mature stage of an institutional board. And so the idea of where should you be, you're not going to be in all of these places at once, but this is a good litmus test to go through to say, what are we doing? What should our priorities be? And then there's also something called the life cycle of nonprofits. But these board passages, often the organization has moved, but the board has not moved. The organization has become more mature, but the board hasn't moved. It's still operating the way it was when it was a founding board. And that's not helpful. The board has to move also. And you're going to get this document along with probably more documents than you ever wanted. Let's go to the next one. This idea is just a little bit more about the growth, startup boards, a lot of the idea of hands-on, operational, sometimes even doing the program delivery, adolescents, less day-to-day, committees, mature. When you get to mature, often for the first time, you have people who are not close to the executive director. Because often the startup boards are somewhat, these are people that the executive director or the founder selected. And then you shift to governance. And then unfortunately, we can get into decline, where the board is just disengaged, can't make quorum, and all that kind of stuff. That's when you start writing letters saying things like, and the board chair writes these letters, and the board chair signs these letters. It said, we are so sorry that you have chosen to no longer be on the board. Volunteers quit us, just like staff. We don't quit them. You have chosen. If people have missed so many meetings, you have not heard from them, they have made the choice. We're sorry that you have chosen to no longer be on our board. We appreciate the 5 minutes or the 3 years that you put in. We hope you will still support us, and we wish you the best. And we need to not be, and if you need to quote a policy or something like that, but this is after people have tried to be in touch with folks. But I think if you have this governance committee that stays in touch with people, that gives people an opportunity to say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And then we end on a high note. Again, we thank them and we end on a high note. And so we don't just let this go on and on and on. And again, this is board to board work. Let's keep going. This is what I wanted to get to. This idea of, this is called a board building cycle. And you notice recruit is not the first one, it's identify. Identify means where do we look and what do we need and who do we need and what type of person do we need? And the soft skills are just as important. How are you with ambiguity? Are you okay? Again, we're working in the future, not finishing something at every meeting. And then how do we cultivate board members? We don't just anoint them and appoint them. We got to cultivate them. Have they participated in some of our events? Have they been volunteers? In most nonprofits, do you know how hard it is to go from being a frontline volunteer to be on the board? It's like you got to cross some invisible cultural line. And it's been very difficult in a lot of organizations to see people who are volunteers to come, frontline volunteers to become board members, which has always messed with my head. And then recruit, then orient. How do we involve people? Do we have committees? How do we do that? And I'm not hung up on committees. We can have task force. We can do all kinds of things. How do we educate board members about being on a board, about our issue, not just about our programs, but first about the issue, then about the organization, then about the programs, and then evaluate, and are we using our term limits? And do we celebrate? Everybody has a birthday. We celebrate the number of years a person has been on the board. So your governance committee could take each one of these pieces and say, how do we do this now? How could we do this more effectively? So that's a year's worth of work right there. But this is the way you actually look at to see how and don't be upset if you're not doing it. It's like, we should do this and we could do this, but to actually take each one of these items and work through these and then come up with a new plan. Or to reaffirm that, we're doing a great job of orienting people, or we're doing a great job of involving people. And how do we know? Because we're evaluating. And then what are we celebrating? And are we only celebrating the people who bring in big money? What are we celebrating? Is the board celebrating? Is the board celebrating staff? It's so important for board to celebrate staff and to let them know that we care about them and that we appreciate them and that we value them. And we need to make sure that our executive directors and our CEOs take their vacation. We need to do that. And if they don't, we really need to say, you can do this. We don't want martyrs. We don't want to burn people out. The board's job is not to burn the executive director out. It is to make sure that we protect this valuable resource called our staff leadership. Let's keep going. And this idea of the board meetings, and I talked about that. Somebody once said that leaders plant seeds for a tree whose shade you won't sit under. Many of the things that board should be talking about now won't be completed this year or next year. These are future thinking things, very strategic things. And we talked about no more reports. And in 2 minutes, I'm gonna stop and take some questions, but you all can get the rest of the deck. Let's keep going. Again, in environment and atmosphere, decision-making and logistics, agenda and scheduling. I don't know how many of you use a consent agenda. You're going to get information on consent agenda. The consent agenda, this whole, we vote on the minutes, we vote on the reports, we vote on the monthly or whatever budget, finances as a package. Now, anybody can take anything off the consent agenda and put it on the active agenda, but we're not voting on each of these things individually. So you're going to get something on the consent agendas. It saves time. At first, people thought it was going to be rubber stamping. No, it doesn't. If there's something that you want to take off the consent agenda and put on the active agenda, that can be done also. So these are just different ways of doing things that can help make our board members, our board meetings, and our time together much more effective and much more generative. But board members are going to have to do things differently. I don't know how many of you use a board portal. One of the groups that I'm on, and I have no stock in it or anything, but we use something called Boardable. And Boardable is amazing. Even I can use Boardable. And BOARDABLE. And it's just great. We used to use Dropbox. That didn't work. And so we started using Boardable, and meetings are put there. All the documents are there. All the agendas are there. Everything is there. So I'm going to encourage you to look into some type of a board portal. It doesn't matter. Again, I'm not promoting Boardable. I'm just saying that it's one that we use on one of the organizations that I have actually learned how to use. And you have to train people, because I was always accustomed to getting back in touch with the administrator. Her name is Hope. So Hope, when is the meeting? And I know that Hope was sitting there in Connecticut, gritting her teeth, and she'd write me an email, Vicki, why don't you go to Boardable? Rather than she'd give me the answers. And like, okay. And so now I have learned that is where I go. I get an update once every other day. Yes, Boardable, that's exactly what it is. The next parts of this is mostly about change and your change management strategy. And let's look at the next slide. And I'm just going to read 2 books. This is what you may feel like, that you're in chaos. So Bridges, Managing Transitions. And then this book called Our Iceberg is Melting, about some penguins who had to learn how to live in a different way. This would be a great book for the board to read. And actually, it's quick. It's got a lot of pictures. And to come up with, what is your change management strategy? What's ending? What are we in the neutral zone? And what do we need to begin? So between Bridges and John Cotter's books, I think you will be where you need to be. So I'm going to stop and take questions, because there's tons more. Shayla, can you go to the slide where they can get in touch with me, which I think got all scrambled? This is all about change and transformation. Way too much stuff. The penguins. Go back one. Yeah. And the idea that the pessimist complains about the wind, the optimist expects it to change, and the realist adjusts the sails. And we need to adjust the sails of our governance strategies. It's not that we've been doing anything wrong. We just know more now. That's all. And so I hope this has been helpful. There was a question. So are you monitoring the questions?
Yes. Thank you, Vicki, so much. Amazing amount of information. I think I get a little feedback here. But Bobby had asked, how do you evaluate the ED on goals set in this kind of COVID year? We talked a little bit about different, not meeting budgets and that, but maybe a little more specific of what you think there.
Thing is to go back and redesign the goals. Yeah, I think all of our goals and all of our plans and all of our budgets might as well have been written in disappearing ink at this point. And so the idea is just to go back and say, well, then here are the goals that he or she met, and this is what that meant, because those goals may not have even been on last year's plan. So I think we actually go back and revisit those. But we do not try to hold people to the goals that were set up prior to, the world turning upside down. But we still need to do some type of an evaluation to make, again, it's getting into the habit of doing it, that we do it. And board chairs need to understand when it's done. It would be wonderful for the board to make a here's what the board is supposed to do in each quarter. This is when we do our evaluation, our board evaluations, our individual evaluations, our board orientation, and so that the board knows what it's supposed to do, much like staff knows what it's supposed to do. Because many board chairs come in and they don't get that, and that's really not fair to them to know what's coming in, what's going to happen in each quarter.
Yeah. Fantastic. Vicki, cannot thank you enough for this amazing information. As we told all of you earlier, this recording will be available. We'll have all of that up a little bit after the conference. We'll get emails, we'll let you know. Also, all of these great handouts and presentation we will email to you. So you'll be able to access this information. You have her contact info. And thank you all so much. Vicki's got another thing.
Let me say one more thing. Jada is saying, thank you, Jada. She said that she's learned a lot. They have advisory boards. I'm interested about the concept of an advisory board because there is only one legal board. And so that would be so we need to be careful about our terminology now because board is a legal duty by the government, not a fiduciary board. But the idea of, so if we set up advisory councils or advisory committees or things like that, that would be interesting to hear about. And then Barbara uses consent agendas and talks about those. And so that's great. And is there anything else?
I think we've got lots of great comments coming in. Like I said, I think this is, first of all, such an amazing topic, but we also had the best presenter we could possibly have. So we're grateful to have Vicki. I think that we'll wrap up just a few minutes early. Let's see, Jada's, I got you. Yeah, National Board of Trustees. And that is, I know that's a complicated issue with a lot of people. I thought, again, Vicki, your point about personal board service really resonated. I've made several presentations recently to some organizations around the state, and there's still a lot of concept that we're going to have an Exxon person on this board. We're going to have a Capital One person on this board. And I made the point, of letting them know, hey, it's you. You're on the hook for all of this personally. And if you leave the organization, you still really are that board member. So I think that was a great point. We could, I think, spend, like Vicki said, days on this. And maybe I would love in 2021, maybe we can get Vicki back to Baton Rouge and do something in person. But thank you so much for doing this virtually from your home in Memphis. Fantastic presentation, great information that is much needed. And I think for those of us even that have years of experience, a good refresher and the idea that everything's different than it was 10 years ago. And I'm finding personally one of the biggest challenges is boards and figuring it out. And I think we're all dealing with that around the state. We have a great lineup today. We'll wrap up, give you a little more of a break because then we've got a couple of sessions with no break in between. But next we have coming up at 10:45, we have Susan Gerard from the Children's Museum in Mississippi. Susan has won a bunch of awards, revolutionized the museum and a lot of the nonprofit giving there in Mississippi. And I think y'all are going to enjoy her. Send us any feedback you have, additional feedback. Feel free to go to the website and email us. And you've got Vicki as well. Vicki, cannot thank you enough. Have a great rest of the day. And everybody else, we'll see you back at 10:45. Thanks so much.